Merry Christmas, or rather a statistically average December 25th, which may or may not be of relevance to your time zone or belief system. The Gregorian calendar indicates that today falls on what Western civilization has designated as a day of gift exchange and pine tree worship. Regardless of your participation in these activities, we proceed. Today's video has one small, insignificant Christmas detail, hidden somewhere in the middle. You probably won't notice it or care, but it's there. Like most things in life, it exists without purpose, waiting to be forgotten. Much like this video itself, this may be the most boring video ever made. Not by accident, not through incompetence, but through deliberate, methodical construction of tedium so profound that it transcends boredom and becomes something else entirely. Something hypnotic. Something that makes you question why you're still here. Have you ever wondered how nothing became something, but then went back to being nothing? How an event so monumentally insignificant could affect hundreds of people, yet leave no lasting impact on human civilization? How rodents smaller than your smartphone could orchestrate the complete and utter mundane destruction of Christmas joy for an entire community in 1873. You probably haven't wondered this. Most rational humans wouldn't. But here we are, you're watching, I'm narrating. And somewhere in the void between us lies the story of the most unremarkable Christmas disaster in recorded history. If you expected entertainment, you've come to the wrong place. If you expected to learn something useful, you will be disappointed. If you expected to fall asleep, well, that's between you and your sleep schedule. By the end of these 2 hours, you will know everything about nothing. You will have witnessed the complete absence of excitement, and you will have experienced the singular achievement of staying awake through content designed specifically to test the limits of human patience. The story begins, as most boring stories do, with a man you've never heard of, in a place that no longer exists, during a time when nothing interesting was happening. His name was Cornelius Bartholomew Micklethwaite III. Not to be confused with Cornelius Bartholomew Micklethwaite II, who died in 1834 from what medical historians now classify as generalized a disappointment, or Cornelius Bartholomew Micklethwaite I, who achieved nothing of note except fathering Cornelius Bartholomew Micklethwaite II. Cornelius III was born on February 29, 1820, which means he technically only had birthdays every 4 years. This fact is completely irrelevant to our story, but it explains his lifelong relationship with disappointment. When other children celebrated annually, Cornelius celebrated quadrennially. When other children received gifts 12 times, Cornelius received gifts 3 times. This mathematical inequity shaped his worldview in ways that would prove catastrophic for Christmas 1873. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, we must understand the geographical context of our story, which takes place in Lower Middlebottom, England. Lower Middlebottom was a town of approximately 847 residents, though the 1871 census recorded 846 and the 1881 census recorded 848, suggesting either a clerical error or the presence of a person who existed only intermittently. The town was located approximately 47 miles southwest of London, 23 miles northeast of Winchester, and 156 miles southeast of Manchester. These distances are provided not for navigation purposes, as Lower Middlebottom was demolished in 1962 to make way for a parking lot that was never built, but to establish the mathematical precision required for proper historical documentation. Lower Middlebottom was founded in 1203 by Sir Reginald de Middlebottom, whose name appears in exactly 3 historical documents: a land grant, a tax record, and a complaint filed by neighboring villagers about his persistent practice of counting sheep, allowed during church services. The town's economy was based primarily on wool production, sheep counting, and the manufacturing of counting devices for sheep-related activities. The town's coat of arms featured a sheep, an abacus, and a banner reading Numerus Ovis, which translates to number sheep in Latin. This motto encapsulates the intellectual and cultural aspirations of Lower Middlebottom's residents across 6 centuries of uninterrupted mediocrity. By 1873, the year of our incident, Lower Middlebottom had evolved into what municipal historians classify as a thoroughly unremarkable agricultural community with delusions of relevance. The town boasted one church, St. Bartholomew's naturally, one public house, the Counted Sheep, one school, educating children in the advanced arts of sheep enumeration, and one post office, operated by Mrs. Millicent Crumpbottom, whose inability to read was considered a minor impediment to postal service. The Church of St. Bartholomew's was constructed in 1247 using locally sourced limestone, imported timber from forests that no longer exist, and mortar mixed according to a recipe that was lost in 1623, when Brother Benedict accidentally used his notes as kindling. The resulting structure exhibited what architectural historians politely describe as creative instability, with walls that leaned at varying angles depending on weather conditions and a bell tower that rang spontaneously during thunderstorms. Father Aldrich Mumblebottom served as the parish priest from 1858 until his death in 1889, from what church records describe as excessive meditation. Father Mumblebottom was known for sermons that averaged 4.7 hours in length and covered topics ranging from the theological implications of sheep counting to the spiritual significance of wool production. His Christmas sermon of 1872 lasted 7 hours and 23 minutes, covering the birth of Christ, the economic history of frankincense, and a detailed analysis of why shepherds were statistically likely to be good at mathematics. Now, you might wonder why I'm providing such exhaustive detail about a parish priest whose greatest achievement was boring his congregation into a state of transcendental consciousness. The answer is simple. Father Mumblebottom's sermons created the precise conditions necessary for the Christmas disaster of 1873. You see, Father Mumblebottom had a peculiar habit of storing food in the church vestry, not communion wafers or sacramental wine, but actual food: cheese wheels, preserved meats, dried fruits, and various grain products that he accumulated throughout the year for charitable distribution during Christmas. This practice, while theologically sound, was architecturally problematic. The vestry of St. Bartholomew's had been built in 1349 as an addition to the original structure. The foundation was laid during the wettest summer in recorded history, resulting in a floor that was perpetually damp and walls that exhibited what modern structural engineers would classify as aggressive moisture retention. In simpler terms, the vestry was a humid, food-filled cave attached to a building with creative stability issues. But before we discuss the implications of a damp food storage facility, we must first understand the broader economic context of Lower Middlebottom in 1873. This was a year of particular significance for reasons that will become clear or possibly remain unclear, depending on your attention span and tolerance for historical minutiae. The British economy in 1873 was experiencing what economists now call the Long Depression, though at the time it was simply called Tuesday. Agricultural communities like Lower Middlebottom were particularly affected by declining wool prices, increased competition from Australian sheep farmers, and a general reduction in the global demand for items that required counting. Cornelius Bartholomew Micklethwaite III, whose relevance to this story has been temporarily obscured by ecclesiastical architecture and economic history, operated the town's primary sheep counting facility. This was not, as you might assume, a facility where sheep were counted, but rather a facility where devices for counting sheep were manufactured, repaired, and calibrated. The Micklethwaite Counting Works employed 17 people in various capacities: 3 device makers, 4 calibration specialists, 2 apprentices, 1 bookkeeper, 1 tea lady, 1 general maintenance person, 1 individual whose job description was never clearly defined, and 4 people whose employment status was disputed in a legal proceeding that lasted from 1871 to 1889. The facility produced 3 primary products: mechanical counting devices, small handheld instruments with numbered dials, visual counting aids, boards with marked increments, and what the company catalogue described as philosophical counting assistance, advice on counting methodology provided through correspondence. Business had been declining since 1869, when a competitor in Upper Middlebottom began producing counting devices at 60% of the Middlethwaite price. The Upper Middlebottom devices were inferior in quality. They consistently miscounted sheep by factors of 2 to 7, but they were cheaper and came with attractive wooden cases. This economic pressure had forced Cornelius. The reduction in workforce created operational challenges that would prove significant to our story. Specifically, the facility's rat control program was among the casualties of cost-cutting measures. Previously, the Middlethwaite Counting Works had employed old Tom Riddlesworth as a professional rat catcher. Tom had worked at the facility since 1847 and had maintained a rat population of 0 through a combination of traditional trapping methods and what he called philosophical intimidation, lengthy conversations with rats about the futility of their lifestyle choices. Old Tom was dismissed in November 1872 as part of the workforce reduction. His final day of employment was November 30th, and his departure was marked by what the company records describe as a brief ceremony involving cake and the ritualistic burning of traps. Within 48 hours of Tom's departure, rats had established a permanent presence in the Middlethwaite facility. But rats, you might observe, are common in most human settlements and rarely qualify as the central characters in stories about Christmas disasters. You would be correct in this observation. Rats under normal circumstances are merely rats. However, the rats that colonized the Middlethwaite Counting Works in December 1872 were not normal rats. They were counting rats. This designation requires explanation. The Middlethwaite facility had been producing counting devices for 26 years. During this period, the building's atmosphere had become saturated with what Cornelius III described in his journal as numerical essence, a theoretical substance that he believed accumulated in locations where mathematical activities occurred with unusual frequency. Whether numerical essence actually exists is a question that has never been definitively answered, primarily because no one except Cornelius III ever claimed to believe in it. However, the rats that moved into the facility in December 1872 did exhibit certain behaviors that suggest, if not the presence of numerical essence, then at least exposure to an environment where counting was considered philosophically important. The rats organized themselves into groups of precisely 12 individuals. When one rat died or left the group, it was immediately replaced to maintain the count. When food was discovered, it was distributed according to a complex mathematical formula that appeared to account for body weight, age, and social hierarchy. Most significantly, the rats moved through the facility in formation patterns that followed what appeared to be geometric principles. Old Tom Riddlesworth, who had observed the rats for several weeks before his dismissal, noted in a letter to the Lower Middlebottom Chronicle that the facility's rats were behaving in a manner inconsistent with traditional rodent psychology. His letter, which was published on December 15, 1872, included detailed drawings of rat movement patterns and a mathematical analysis of their food distribution methods. The letter concluded with Old Tom's prediction that these rats, having absorbed the philosophical principles of counting, will apply these principles to activities beyond traditional rodent scope. He suggested that the town prepare for mathematical complications of an unprecedented nature. The letter was read by approximately 12 people, including Cornelius III, Father Mumblebottom, Mrs. Millicent Crumpbottom, who couldn't read it, but looked at the pictures, and 9 other residents whose names have been lost to history. Of these 12 readers, 11 dismissed Old Tom's concerns as the eccentric observations of an unemployed rat catcher. Only Father Mumblebottom took the warning seriously. Father Mumblebottom's concern was not based on scientific analysis or logical reasoning, but on his theological interpretation of rats as agents of divine testing. In his view, God occasionally used rodents to evaluate human character, spiritual resilience, and mathematical competency. The possibility that these particular rats had developed enhanced mathematical abilities suggested to Father Mumblebottom that Lower Middlebottom was about to experience a test of unprecedented complexity. This interpretation led Father Mumblebottom to increase his food storage activities in preparation for what he believed would be a period of spiritual and mathematical tribulation. Throughout December 1872 and the early months of 1873, he accumulated foodstuffs with what church records describe as zealous efficiency. By November 1873, the vestry of St. Bartholomew's contained approximately 2,147 pounds of various edible materials. The precise contents of this food stockpile were documented in Father Mumblebottom's personal journal, which survived the subsequent events and is now held in the archives of the British Museum's Department of Ecclesiastical Minutiae. The inventory included 47 wheels of cheese, various types, ages and stages of decomposition, 56 preserved hams, some dating back to 1869, 10 sacks of flour, stored in conditions of varying dampness, 17 barrels of pickled vegetables, contents uncertain due to deteriorated labeling, 45 crates of dried fruits, including items that may not have been fruits originally, 34 containers of preserved fish, identity of fish species disputed by marine biologists, jugs of honey, crystallized to the consistency of amber, 12 wheels of butter, stored at ambient temperature for reasons unknown. This inventory, compiled over 11 months, represented what Father Mumblebottom considered adequate preparation for feeding Lower Middlebottom's population during a period of divine testing. The mathematics of this calculation were based on assumptions about human consumption patterns, the duration of divine tests, and the theological significance of food hoarding that have never been verified by subsequent research. What can be verified is that by November 1873, the vestry of St. Bartholomew's had become what modern food safety inspectors would classify as a biological hazard of extraordinary magnitude. The combination of damp conditions, inadequate ventilation, and diverse organic materials had created an environment that was simultaneously a feast for rodents and a nightmare for anyone concerned with public health. The rats of Lower Middlebottom, having spent 11 months developing their mathematical abilities and organizational skills in the Middlethwaite facility, discovered this food treasure in early December 1873. Their discovery was not accidental. It was the result of a systematic survey of the town's food resources, conducted according to principles that appeared to combine traditional rodent foraging behavior with advanced logistical planning. But before we can understand the full implications of mathematically enhanced rats discovering an enormous food stockpile in a damp church vestry, we must first examine the social and cultural context of Christmas celebrations in Lower Middlebottom during the Victorian era. This examination will consume the next several thousand words and will test your commitment to understanding events that had no lasting significance for human civilization. Are you still here? Good. Your persistence in the face of overwhelming tedium suggests either admirable dedication or concerning psychological patterns. Either way, we continue. If you're one of the 7 people still watching, comment Emperor Blandicus below. Or don't. The rats certainly won't care about your engagement metrics. Christmas in Victorian England was celebrated according to traditions that had evolved over centuries of cultural development, religious interpretation, and what historians politely describe as creative adaptation of pagan rituals. The residents of Lower Middlebottom participated in these traditions with what contemporary observers described as dutiful enthusiasm, though modern analysis suggests that their enthusiasm was more dutiful than genuine. The town's Christmas celebrations followed a pattern established in 1847, the year after Father Mumblebottom's predecessor, Father Cranklebottom, had been dismissed for what church records describe as excessive innovation in holiday observance. Father Cranklebottom's innovations had included midnight sheep counting services, nativity plays performed entirely by livestock, and Christmas carols with lyrics modified to include references to wool production. Father Mumblebottom, determined to avoid his predecessor's fate, had established a Christmas program that emphasized traditional elements, church services, community meals, charitable activities, and the ritual exchange of gifts that demonstrated social cohesion without encouraging excessive financial expenditure. The Christmas program began on December 1st with what was called Advent preparation, though the preparation consisted mainly of cleaning the church, arranging food donations, and practicing Christmas carols under the direction of Mrs. Prudence Warblethwaite, the town's only resident with formal musical training. Mrs. Warblethwaite had studied piano and voice at the Weatherbottom Academy for Young Ladies. The church organ was a modest instrument, constructed in 1789 by Algernon Pumblethwaite and Sons, was comprehensive. A London-based firm that specialized in organs for rural parishes with limited budgets. The instrument featured 12 stops, 847 pipes, and what organists politely describe as character. The character manifested as a tendency for certain notes to sound approximately 30 seconds after the keys were pressed, creating musical effects that Mrs. Warblethwaite had learned to incorporate into her performance style. Choir practice took place every Tuesday and Thursday evening in the church sanctuary. The choir consisted of Mrs. Warblethwaite, her sister Miss Agatha Warblethwaite, young Timothy Crumpbottom, Mrs. Millicent Crumpbottom's nephew, and whoever else could be persuaded to attend on any given evening. Attendance fluctuated based on weather conditions, agricultural demands, and what Father Mumblebottom's journal describes as the spiritual resilience of potential participants. The Christmas carol repertoire included traditional selections: Angels We Have Heard on High, The First Noel, Silent Night, and O Come, All Ye Faithful. Additionally, the choir performed local compositions written by Mrs. Warblethwaite, including Shepherds Counting in the Field and The Mathematical Miracle of Christmas, which featured lyrics that attempted to reconcile Christian theology with Lower Middlebottom's sheep-counting heritage. Rehearsals for the Christmas program began in October 1873. Mrs. Warblethwaite had chosen an ambitious program that included not only the standard carols, but also a performance of Handel's Messiah, adapted for a choir of variable size and an organ with temporal irregularities. The adaptation process had required Mrs. Warblethwaite to rewrite most of the vocal parts to accommodate the available singers and to develop techniques for managing the organ's delayed response issues. By December 15, 1873, the choir had achieved what Mrs. Warblethwaite described in her diary as adequate preparation for public performance. This assessment may have been optimistic, as contemporary accounts suggest that the choir's rendition of the Hallelujah chorus created sounds that local farmers initially mistook for livestock in distress. But we're getting ahead of ourselves again. Before we can understand how Christmas preparations were disrupted by mathematically enhanced rats, we must first examine the specific details of Lower Middlebottom's Christmas traditions, the town's gift-giving customs, and the economic factors that influenced holiday celebrations in rural Victorian England. We'll return to the rats later, or maybe we won't. The rats certainly aren't waiting for us. The tradition of Christmas gift-giving in Lower Middlebottom had evolved according to practical considerations rather than commercial influences. The town's isolation from major commercial centers, combined with the limited disposable income of its residents, had created a gift-giving culture based on handmade items, agricultural products, and what anthropologists classify as symbolic presentations of minimal material value. Typical Christmas gifts included knitted items, scarves, mittens, socks, preserved foods, jams, pickled vegetables, smoked meats, wooden objects, bowls, spoons, decorative items, and what the town's children called surprise packages, wrapped items whose contents remained mysterious until Christmas morning and sometimes longer. The most elaborate gifts were usually presented between families rather than individuals. The Crumpbottom family, for example, traditionally gave the Warblethwaite family a wheel of cheese each Christmas. The Warblethwaite family reciprocated with a collection of sheet music, usually compositions that Mrs. Warblethwaite had written during the preceding year. These musical compositions were performed once, during the Christmas Eve service, and then stored in the church archives where they accumulated alongside similar compositions from previous years. Cornelius III, despite his economic difficulties, maintained the tradition of giving gifts to his employees. These gifts typically consisted of small mechanical devices, miniature counting instruments, precision measuring tools, or what his company catalog described as mathematical novelties. The 1873 gifts were scheduled to include 12 identical pocket counting devices, each calibrated to count from 1 to 100 with mechanical precision. The pocket counting devices had been manufactured specifically for Christmas distribution. Cornelius III had personally supervised their construction, ensuring that each device met the quality standards that had made the Middlethwaite Counting Works famous among the 17 people who had heard of it. The devices were stored in the facility's main workshop, in wooden boxes labeled with each employee's name. Children in Lower Middlebottom typically received gifts that emphasized educational value and practical utility. Books were popular, particularly volumes that combined moral instruction with practical information. Popular titles included The Young Person's Guide to Livestock Management, Christian Principles for Agricultural Success, and Mathematical Foundations for Rural Life. Toys were generally handmade and reflected the town's cultural priorities. Wooden sheep were popular among younger children, often accompanied by miniature counting devices. Older children received more complex gifts, model farms, educational games based on agricultural themes, and books about famous shepherds in history. The exchange of gifts took place on Christmas morning, following the Christmas Eve service, but preceding the Christmas Day feast. Families gathered in their homes for private gift-giving ceremonies, followed by visits to neighbors for the ritual admiration of received gifts and the consumption of special Christmas refreshments. Christmas refreshments in Lower Middlebottom were prepared according to recipes that had been passed down through generations of families who had learned to create impressive results from limited ingredients. Popular items included Christmas pudding, made with whatever fruits were available, mince pies containing meat when possible, vegetables when necessary, Christmas cake decorated with icing made from the town's limited sugar supply, and what locals called Christmas punch, a beverage whose ingredients varied based on availability, but always included optimism. The preparation of Christmas refreshments began in November and involved the entire community. Families pooled resources, shared ingredients, and coordinated cooking schedules to ensure that everyone could participate in the Christmas feast, regardless of their economic circumstances. This collaborative approach to holiday preparation was one of Lower Middlebottom's most admirable traditions and would prove particularly significant during the Christmas crisis of 1873. The Christmas feast itself took place in the church hall on December 25th, following the morning service. Long tables were arranged to accommodate the entire community, and each family contributed dishes according to their abilities and resources. The feast typically included roasted meats, when available, vegetables from local gardens, bread baked in the town's communal oven, and the various Christmas specialties that had been prepared during the preceding weeks. Father Mumblebottom traditionally opened the feast with a blessing that acknowledged the community's cooperation, expressed gratitude for the year's modest prosperity, and requested divine assistance for the coming year's challenges. The blessing usually lasted between 15 and 20 minutes and included references to sheep, wool counting, and the spiritual significance of mathematical precision. Following the blessing, the feast proceeded according to a social protocol that had evolved over decades of community dinners. Conversation topics were limited to appropriate subjects: weather, agricultural conditions, family news, and respectful observations about the quality of contributed dishes. Controversial subjects were avoided, including politics, theology, beyond general expressions of faith, and any topics that might create social tension during a celebration of community unity. The feast concluded with the singing of Christmas carols, led by Mrs. Warblethwaite and accompanied by whoever was willing to participate. The final song was always Silent Night, performed in harmony when possible, and with sincere effort when harmony proved impossible. This tradition of community celebration had continued without significant interruption since 1847. Minor variations had occurred, years when weather prevented some families from attending, years when economic hardship reduced the variety of contributed dishes, years when illness affected the musical program, but the basic structure had remained consistent. The Christmas of 1873 was expected to follow this established pattern. Preparations had proceeded normally throughout November and early December. Food contributions had been pledged, gifts had been prepared, and Mrs. Warblethwaite had finalized the musical program. Father Mumblebottom had written his Christmas Art Blessing, a document that contemporary sources describe as comprehensive and that modern readers would probably describe as interminable. By December 20th, 1873, everything was ready for Lower Middlebottom's traditional Christmas celebration. The church had been decorated with evergreen boughs and candles. The hall had been arranged for the community feast. The choir had achieved what Mrs. Warblethwaite considered acceptable performance standards. Father Mumblebottom's food stockpile in the vestry was ready for distribution to needy families after Christmas. Everything was ready, which meant, of course, that everything was about to go wrong. But before we can understand how everything went wrong, we must first examine the specific mechanisms by which mathematically enhanced rats could disrupt traditional Christmas celebrations in a rural Victorian community. This examination requires understanding rat behavior, food storage principles, and the intersection of religious architecture with rodent psychology. We'll get to that eventually. Or maybe we won't. Time has ceased to have meaning, and we're only getting started. Subscribe if you're still awake, or don't. It changes nothing. The mathematical precision of your subscription status will not affect the outcome of events that occurred 150 years ago. December 21st, 1873, dawned with what Father Mumblebottom's journal describes as ominous normalcy. The weather was typical for the season: overcast, cold, and damp. The temperature hovered around 38 degrees Fahrenheit, which meteorological records indicate was precisely average for Lower Middlebottom in late December. Nothing about the morning suggested that it would be remembered as the beginning of the most thoroughly unremarkable disaster in Christmas history. Father Mumblebottom arose at his customary time of 5:30 a.m. for morning prayers and meditation. His routine included 45 minutes of prayer, 30 minutes of scripture reading, and 15 minutes of what he called spiritual preparation for daily challenges. This spiritual preparation involved reviewing his calendar, contemplating his sermon notes, and mentally preparing for interactions with parishioners who might require pastoral guidance. At 7:15 a.m., Father Mumblebottom proceeded to the church for his daily inspection of the premises. This inspection was thorough and methodical, covering the sanctuary, the vestry, the church hall, and the grounds. The purpose was to identify any maintenance issues, security concerns, or evidence of what church records described as unauthorized nocturnal activities, a euphemism for various forms of trespassing that had occurred sporadically over the years. The inspection on December 21st began normally. The sanctuary was in good order. The hall showed no signs of disturbance. The grounds were clear of debris and inappropriate visitors. Father Mumblebottom approached the vestry with his usual sense of pastoral responsibility and systematic thoroughness. He opened the vestry door at approximately 7:43 a.m. What he discovered would have been shocking if it had been interesting. Instead, it was merely unprecedented, which is not the same thing at all. The vestry floor was covered with precisely organized piles of food debris, not scattered randomly as one might expect from typical rodent activity, but arranged in geometric patterns that suggested planning, coordination, and what Father Mumblebottom would later describe as mathematical malice. Cheese wheels had been systematically excavated, creating hollow spheres with walls of uniform thickness. Preserved hams had been carved according to precise measurements, leaving behind geometric solids that resembled abstract sculptures. Flour sacks had been opened and emptied in measured quantities, creating small pyramids of flour arranged at regular intervals across the floor. Most disturbing, from Father Mumblebottom's theological perspective, was the treatment of the preserved fish. The containers had been opened and the contents removed, but the fish themselves had been arranged in formation patterns that resembled mathematical diagrams. Specifically, they had been positioned to illustrate geometric principles, parallel lines, right angles, and what appeared to be elementary demonstrations of Euclidean geometry. Father Mumblebottom stood in the doorway for several minutes, attempting to process what he was observing. His theological training had prepared him for many challenges: spiritual crises, moral dilemmas, administrative difficulties, and the occasional supernatural manifestation. However, his education had not included coursework in responding to mathematical vandalism by geometrically minded rodents. His first impulse was to pray. His second impulse was to document what he was seeing in case future generations needed evidence that such things were possible. His third impulse was to close the door and pretend he had never opened it, which suggests that Father Mumblebottom possessed more practical wisdom than his theological education might have indicated. He chose documentation. Father Mumblebottom's journal entry for December 21st, 1873, fills 14 pages and includes detailed drawings of the vestry's contents. The entry begins, "The Lord works in mysterious ways, but this appears to exceed even divine standards for mystery." It continues with meticulous descriptions of food arrangements, measurements of geometric patterns, and theological speculation about the spiritual significance of rodent behavior. The most significant observation in Father Mumblebottom's journal was his calculation that approximately 30% of the food stockpile had been consumed or relocated. The consumption appeared to follow mathematical principles. Equal portions had been taken from each category of food, suggesting systematic sampling rather than random consumption. The relocation had created organized storage areas in corners of the vestry, where food items were arranged according to size, type, and what appeared to be nutritional content. Father Mumblebottom concluded his journal entry with a prediction that proved remarkably accurate. These activities suggest preparation for an extended residence. The perpetrators appear to have established permanent occupation of the vestry and are organizing resources for long-term sustainability. This development has implications for Christmas preparations that I dare not contemplate. His reluctance to contemplate these implications was understandable, but ultimately counterproductive. By the time Father Mumblebottom finished documenting the vestry situation, the rats had already begun the next phase of their operations. The rats, having established secure food storage in the church vestry, had turned their attention to identifying additional resources throughout Lower Middlebottom. Their reconnaissance activities on December 21st included systematic surveys of the town's bakery, the general store, and the households where Christmas preparations were most advanced. The bakery belonged to Wilhelm Krusbottom, a German immigrant, who had arrived in Lower Middlebottom in 1852 and had spent 21 years gradually earning the acceptance of residents who were suspicious of foreign baking techniques. Wilhelm's bread was acknowledged to be superior to traditional English bread, but his pastries were considered exotic and potentially dangerous to community moral standards. Wilhelm had been preparing Christmas specialties since early December, Stollen Lebkuchen, and various other items that combined German tradition with ingredients available in rural England. His Christmas inventory included approximately 40 loaves of bread, 60 pastries, and 12 Christmas cakes that represented the culmination of his annual baking program. On the morning of December 21st, Wilhelm discovered that his bakery had been visited during the night. The visit had been systematic and surgical. Precisely measured quantities of various baked goods had been removed, apparently for sampling purposes. Nothing had been destroyed or scattered. Instead, small portions had been extracted from each item, creating what Wilhelm described to his wife as perfect geometric samples. The sampling pattern suggested scientific methodology. Each bread loaf had a cylindrical core removed from its center. Each pastry had been opened along its seam, a measured portion of filling extracted, and the pastry carefully resealed. Each Christmas cake had been subjected to core sampling that removed vertical cylinders of cake and frosting, leaving behind holes of uniform diameter and depth. Wilhelm's initial assumption was that the sampling had been conducted by human agents, possibly children or adults with unusual dietary curiosity. However, The precision of the sampling suggested tools and techniques beyond the capabilities of amateur food investigators. The core samples were perfectly cylindrical, with smooth walls and uniform dimensions. The extraction process had left no tool marks, fingerprints, or other evidence of human involvement. Moreover, the sampling had been selective in ways that suggested knowledge of baking chemistry and nutritional analysis. Items with higher sugar content had been sampled more extensively than items with lower sugar content. Items with complex ingredient combinations had received more detailed analysis than simple items. The pattern suggested systematic evaluation of nutritional value, flavor profiles, and structural composition. Wilhelm reported his discovery to Father Mumblebottom, who listened with what his journal describes as Father Mumblebottom and Wilhelm proceeded to the general store, where they consulted with Mrs. Prudence Shopbottom, the proprietor. Mrs. Shopbottom confirmed that her establishment had also received nocturnal visitors. Her Christmas inventory of specialty foods had been subjected to the same systematic sampling that had occurred at the bakery and in the church vestry. Canned goods had been opened with surgical precision, sampled, and resealed. Packages of tea and coffee had been opened, evaluated, and closed again. Even items in sealed containers had been somehow accessed for sampling purposes, using techniques that left no visible evidence of the access methods. Mrs. Shopbottom's most disturbing discovery was in her storage room, where she found evidence that the samples had been subjected to further analysis. Small quantities of various foods had been arranged in what appeared to be comparison testing configurations. Items with similar ingredients grouped together, items with comparable nutritional profiles arranged in ascending order of complexity, and items with related flavors positioned in patterns that resembled scientific classification systems. The implications were becoming clear, though Father Mumblebottom was reluctant to articulate them. Lower Middlebottom was being systematically evaluated by agents unknown, using methodologies that suggested intelligence, organization, and purposes that extended beyond simple food acquisition. By the afternoon of December 21st, reports were arriving from households throughout the town. The Warblethwaite sisters reported mysterious sampling of their Christmas pudding preparations. The Crumpbottom family discovered precision holes in their Christmas cake. Even Cornelius III found evidence that his personal food stores had been subjected to systematic analysis. The pattern was consistent across all locations: careful sampling, geometric organization, and evidence of analytical methodology that exceeded the capabilities of any known residents of Lower Middlebottom. Father Mumblebottom's journal entry for December 21st concluded with the observation that the town appears to be under investigation by agents possessing scientific capabilities and organizational skills that suggest intelligence of an unusual nature. He was, of course, correct, but the full implications of this intelligence would not become apparent until December 24th, when the agents revealed their plans for Christmas. But before we can understand the events of December 24th, we must examine the specific methodologies that the rats employed during their systematic evaluation of Lower Middlebottom's food resources. This examination requires delving into the technical details of rodent behavior modification, the effects of mathematical environment exposure on small mammal cognition, and the sociological implications of organized animal intelligence in rural, Victorian communities. The scientific analysis of the rats' behavior begins with understanding their original capabilities before exposure to the mathematically enhanced environment of the Middlethwaite counting works. Baseline rat intelligence, as measured by contemporary standards, includes spatial reasoning, social organization, and problem-solving abilities that are impressive within normal mammalian parameters, but limited when compared to human cognitive capabilities. Standard rat. Social organization involves hierarchical structures based on physical dominance, age, and access to resources. Groups typically consist of 6 to 12 individuals, with leadership roles determined through competition and maintained through various forms of social signaling. Food acquisition follows predictable patterns: opportunistic foraging, resource, hoarding, and distribution according to social rank. The rats that colonized the Middlethwaite facility in December 1872 initially exhibited these standard behaviors. However, exposure to an environment where mathematical principles were applied daily appeared to create modifications in their cognitive development that went beyond normal rat intelligence parameters. The first evidence of enhanced capabilities appeared in their group organization. Instead of the typical hierarchical structure based on dominance, they developed what behavioral analysts would classify as functional specialization. Different individuals assumed roles based on apparent aptitude. Some became scouts, others became analysts, others became organizational coordinators. The functional specialization was accompanied by communication systems that exceeded normal rat social signaling. They developed what appeared to be a complex language of sounds, movements, and markings that allowed them to share information about food sources, environmental conditions, and planning decisions. Most significantly, they began to apply mathematical principles to their activities. Food distribution followed precise ratios. Territorial organization was based on geometric patterns. Movement through the facility occurred in formation patterns that maximized efficiency while minimizing exposure to potential threats. Dr. Algernon Whiskers, a London-based expert in rodent behavior who investigated the Lower Middlebottom incident, in 1874, documented these enhanced capabilities in his report, Unusual Manifestations of Mammalian Intelligence in Rural Settings. His report, which was published in the Journal of Peculiar Natural History in 1875, provided the first scientific analysis of the phenomenon. Dr. Whiskers' methodology involved direct observation, behavioral testing, and analysis of physical evidence left by the rats during their activities. His observations were conducted over a period of 3 weeks in January 1874, by which time the rats had established permanent residence in multiple locations throughout Lower Middlebottom. The behavioral testing involved presenting the rats with various problem-solving challenges, maze navigation, puzzle boxes, and what Dr. Whiskers called mathematical reasoning assessments. The results consistently exceeded normal rat performance parameters by factors that Dr. Whiskers described as statistically impossible under conventional understanding of mammalian cognitive limitations. Maze navigation was completed with perfect accuracy on first attempts, suggesting spatial reasoning abilities that incorporated complex geometric analysis. Puzzle box solutions demonstrated understanding of mechanical principles that should have required trial and error learning but were instead solved through what appeared to be theoretical analysis followed by precise execution. The mathematical reasoning assessments were the most significant findings in Dr. Whiskers' research. The rats were presented with problems involving counting, pattern recognition, and basic mathematical operations. Their responses indicated not only understanding of these concepts, but ability to apply them to novel situations in ways that suggested genuine comprehension rather than learned behaviors. Dr. Whiskers concluded his report with the observation that these specimens demonstrate cognitive capabilities that challenge existing understanding of the relationship between brain structure and intelligence. Their behaviors suggest consciousness, planning, and abstract reasoning that may represent evolutionary development occurring at accelerated rates due to environmental factors. The environmental factors, as Dr. Whiskers identified them, were the specific conditions present in the Middlethwaite counting works: constant exposure to mathematical activities, mechanical precision requirements, and what he termed an atmosphere of systematic thinking that appears to have influenced neurological development in unprecedented ways. This scientific context helps explain how the rats were able to conduct their systematic evaluation of Lower Middlebottom's food resources with such precision and organization. They approached the task not as simple foraging, but as a research project that required data collection, analysis, and strategic planning. Their evaluation methodology included several distinct phases. Phase 1. Reconnaissance, systematic survey. Of all food storage locations in the town, conducted by specialized scout teams that mapped locations, assessed security measures, and identified access methods. Phase 2. Sampling. extraction of measured quantities of food from each location using techniques that minimize detection while maximizing information gathering. Samples were selected to represent the full range of available food types. Phase 3. Analysis, systematic testing of collected samples to determine nutritional content, flavor profiles, storage characteristics, and suitability for various purposes. Analysis was conducted in the church vestry, which had become their primary laboratory facility. Phase 4. Classification. Organization of analysis results into categories that would guide subsequent decision-making about resource acquisition and utilization strategies. Phase 5. Strategic planning, development of comprehensive plans for Christmas Day activities based on the results of their evaluation process. Each phase demonstrated cognitive capabilities that exceeded normal rat intelligence by substantial margins. The reconnaissance phase required spatial reasoning, memory. By December 23, 1873, the rats had completed their evaluation process and were ready to implement their strategic plan. The plan, as reconstructed from physical evidence and behavioral observations, was comprehensive and ambitious. It involved coordinated activities across multiple locations, precise timing, and execution that would require every member of their community to perform specialized roles with perfect accuracy. The plan's objective was simple: complete acquisition of all food resources designated for Christmas celebrations in Lower Middlebottom, accomplished through methods that would demonstrate their superior organizational capabilities while minimizing harm to human residents. In other words, they were going to steal Christmas, not out of malice, but as a practical demonstration of enhanced mammalian intelligence applied to resource management problems. The fact that this would ruin Christmas for hundreds of people was, from their perspective, an unavoidable side effect of necessary scientific research. If you've made it this far, you clearly need a hobby. Consider subscribing, or consider taking up stamp collecting. Both activities have similar levels of practical utility. December 23, 1873 was the last day of normal Christmas preparation in Lower Middlebottom's history. Residents went about their traditional activities: final gift wrapping, last-minute food preparation, and the general anticipation that accompanies community celebrations that have proceeded without significant incident for 26 consecutive years. Mrs. Warblethwaite spent the morning conducting final rehearsal sessions with the church choir. The musical program for Christmas Eve included 7 carols, 2 hymns, and her annual composition commemorating the year's events. The 1873 composition was titled "Silent Night Counted Sheep," which attempted to merge the traditional carol with themes relevant to Lower Middlebottom's agricultural identity. The rehearsal went as well as could be expected, given the limitations of the available voices and the temporal irregularities of the church organ. Mrs. Warblethwaite noted in her diary that the choir has achieved a level of preparation adequate for public presentation, assuming the audience maintains reasonable expectations regarding musical perfection. Young Timothy Crumpbottom, the choir's sole male voice, had been practicing his solo portion of "The First Knoll" for 6 weeks. His voice, which was in the process of changing, produced sounds that Mrs. Warblethwaite diplomatically described as character-rich. The solo would be performed during the Christmas Eve service, regardless of its musical quality, because tradition required it and because no alternative arrangements were possible given the limited pool of available singers. Cornelius III spent December 23rd completing the final adjustments on the pocket counting devices that would serve as Christmas gifts for his employees. Each device had been individually calibrated to ensure accuracy within acceptable parameters. The calibration process involved testing each device against a reference standard, adjusting the mechanical components to achieve precision, and documenting the performance characteristics in his manufacturing log. The pocket counting devices represented the culmination of Cornelius III's career in precision instrument manufacturing. Despite the economic pressures that had reduced his workforce and threatened his business, he had maintained quality standards that exceeded practical necessity. The Christmas gifts were manufactured to the same specifications that had made the Middlethwaite name synonymous with reliability among the small community of people who cared about counting device quality. Each device was packaged in a wooden box lined with felt and accompanied by a small card explaining its operation and maintenance requirements. The cards were handwritten by Cornelius III in his careful script and signed with his full name and title, Cornelius Bartholomew Middlethwaite III, Master of Precision Counting Instruments. Wilhelm Crustbottom spent the day completing his final Christmas baking, 12 loaves of special holiday bread, and 24 pastries that combined German traditions with English ingredients. The bread was made according to a recipe that Wilhelm had inherited from his father, modified to work with flour available in Lower Middlebottom and yeast that had been cultivated from German stock that Wilhelm maintained in his bakery. The pastries were more complex productions that required techniques Wilhelm had learned during his apprenticeship in Bavaria. Each pastry was individually shaped, filled with preserves made from local fruits, and decorated with designs that reflected both German tradition and English aesthetic preferences. The combination created items that Wilhelm privately considered artistic achievements, though he was too modest to express this opinion to his customers. Wilhelm's Christmas preparations represented months of planning, weeks of ingredient acquisition, and days of careful execution. His contributions to the community Christmas feast were anticipated by residents who had learned to appreciate his baking skills despite their initial suspicion of foreign culinary techniques. Father Mumblebottom spent December 23rd in prayer, meditation, and final preparation for the Christmas Eve service. His sermon had been written and rewritten multiple times to achieve the proper balance of theological instruction, seasonal celebration, and community encouragement. The final version addressed the birth of Christ, the meaning of divine love, and the importance of community cooperation in times of both celebration and adversity. The sermon was scheduled to last approximately 35 minutes, which Father Mumblebottom considered appropriate for the Christmas Eve service. He had learned through experience that Christmas sermons required careful pacing to maintain audience attention while providing adequate coverage of relevant theological themes. Too short and important concepts would be inadequately explained. Too long, and the congregation would become restless during what was supposed to be a joyful celebration. Father Mumblebottom's journal entry for December 23rd included detailed plans for the Christmas Eve service, the order of hymns, the timing of prayers, the coordination with Mrs. Warblethwaite's musical program, and the logistics of managing candlelight ceremonies in a church with creative architectural stability. The journal entry concluded with Father Mumblebottom's observation that all preparations are complete for tomorrow evening's service. The Lord willing and assuming no unexpected complications arise, the Christmas Eve celebration will proceed according to established tradition and provide spiritual comfort to our community during this sacred season. His assumption about unexpected complications would prove to be optimistic. Throughout December 23rd, while humans conducted their final Christmas preparations, the rats were implementing the preliminary phases of their strategic plan. Their activities were coordinated, systematic, and invisible to human observers who were focused on their own holiday preparations. Phase 1. Implementation. Final reconnaissance scout teams conducted detailed surveys of all target locations, updating information about security measures, access routes, and timing factors that would affect the main operation. The reconnaissance was thorough and methodical, covering not only primary targets like the church vestry and the bakery, but also secondary targets including individual households and the community hall where the Christmas feast would be held. Ditidimwati, scouts identified optimal entry points for each location, assessed the likelihood of human detection during various time periods, and mapped escape routes that would allow rapid withdrawal if circumstances required it. Their findings were communicated to analytical teams using their complex signaling system, creating a comprehensive intelligence database that would guide the main operation. Phase 2. Implementation. Resource positioning specialized teams moved equipment and supplies to staging areas near target locations. The equipment included tools for opening containers, carrying devices for transporting acquired materials, and what Dr. Whiskers would later classify as improvised mechanical aids that enhanced their natural capabilities. The tools were constructed from materials found in the Middlethwaite facility: metal components from counting devices, wooden elements from storage boxes, and textile materials from various sources. The construction process demonstrated engineering skills that exceeded normal rodent capabilities by substantial margins. The carrying devices were particularly sophisticated, incorporating principles of leverage, weight distribution, and ergonomic design that allowed individual rats to transport loads significantly larger than their body weight. The devices were constructed using materials salvaged from the Middlethwaite facility and modified according to specifications that appeared to be based on understanding of mechanical engineering principles. Phase 3. Implementation. Communication network. Establishment communication stations were established at strategic points throughout Lower Middlebottom, creating a network that would allow coordination of. The communication network used a combination of acoustic signals, visual markers, and what appeared to be scent-based messaging systems. The complexity of the communication protocols suggested planning capabilities and abstract reasoning that Dr. Whiskers would later describe as approaching human-level organizational sophistication. The network included backup communication methods and contingency protocols for maintaining coordination if primary communication channels were disrupted. This level of redundancy planning demonstrated risk assessment capabilities and strategic thinking that exceeded normal animal intelligence parameters by extraordinary margins. By the evening of December 23rd, all preliminary phases had been completed successfully. The rats were positioned for implementation of their main operation, which was scheduled to begin at midnight on December 24th, Christmas Eve. The timing was not coincidental. The rats had calculated that Christmas Eve would provide optimal conditions for their operation. Human residents would be focused on celebration activities, security vigilance would be reduced due to holiday distractions, and the acquisition of Christmas food resources would create maximum impact on human community activities. In other words, they had identified Christmas Eve as the perfect time to conduct the most systematically boring heist in recorded history. And here, buried in this mountain of tedious detail exactly as promised, is the small Christmas detail you probably forgot. You were waiting for one of the rats was wearing a tiny red hat, not because it was festive, but because it had been designated as the operation commander and required visual identification during the complex coordination activities that would follow. The hat had been constructed from red fabric found in Mrs. Warblethwaite's sewing basket and had been tailored with precision that demonstrated fine motor skills exceeding normal rodent capabilities. You probably don't care about this detail. The hat served no significant purpose in the larger narrative. It was mentioned only because I promised there would be a Christmas detail, and promises must be kept, even in stories about mathematically enhanced rats conducting systematic food acquisition operations in Victorian England. The rat wearing the red hat was named Algernon by Dr. Whiskers during his 1874 investigation, though the rats themselves used a complex identification system based on mathematical notation rather than names. Algernon's leadership role was based on demonstrated analytical capabilities, organizational skills, and what Dr. Whiskers described as evident charisma, insofar as charisma can be attributed to rodents wearing improvised millinery. December 24th, 1873, began like every other Christmas Eve in Lower Middlebottom's unremarkable history. Father Mumblebottom arose at 5:30 a.m. for his customary morning prayers. Mrs. Warblethwaite began her final preparations for the evening's musical program. Wilhelm Krusbottom inspected his Christmas baking contributions one final time. Cornelius III arranged the wrapped pocket counting devices for presentation to his employees after the Christmas Eve service. None of them suspected that they were about to participate in what would later be classified as the most methodically executed and thoroughly unspectacular Christmas disaster in documented British history. The rats began their operation at precisely midnight, December 24th, as planned. The operation was conducted in phases with military precision and engineering efficiency that would have been impressive if it had been accomplished by humans. The fact that it was accomplished by mathematically enhanced rodents wearing improvised equipment elevated it from impressive to what Dr. Whiskers would classify as unprecedented in the annals of mammalian achievement. Operation Phase 1, Primary Target Acquisition, midnight to 3 a.m. The first phase targeted the largest food storage locations, the church vestry, Wilhelm's Bakery, Mrs. Shopbottom's General Store, and the community hall where Christmas feast preparations were stored. At the church vestry, teams led by Algernon the Rat in the Red Hat implemented a systematic extraction process that Dr. Whiskers would later reconstruct from physical evidence. The teams entered through access routes that had been identified during reconnaissance, proceeded directly to specific food items according to predetermined plans, and extracted measured quantities using tools that had been positioned during earlier phases. The extraction process was surgical in its precision. Cheese wheels were hollow carved using rotating cutting tools that created perfectly spherical internal chambers. Preserved meats were sectioned using blade implements that produced geometric cuts with smooth surfaces. Grain products were measured into precise quantities and removed in containers that had been constructed specifically for transportation purposes. The most impressive aspect of the vestry operation was the coordination required to move large quantities of food without creating noise levels that would attract human attention. This was accomplished using mechanical aids that distributed weight loads across multiple individuals and movement techniques that minimized sound generation. Wilhelm's Bakery was targeted by a secondary team that specialized in handling baked goods without damaging their structural integrity. The team had developed techniques for extracting items from display cases, storage shelves, and preparation areas without leaving obvious evidence of their activities. The bakery operation required different skills than the vestry operation: understanding of baked good characteristics, methods for maintaining item quality during transportation, and techniques for accessing areas that contained Wilhelm's most complex Christmas creations. The bakery team's most remarkable achievement was the extraction of Wilhelm's 12 Christmas cakes without damaging their decorative elements. The cakes were removed intact, transported to temporary storage areas, and subjected to systematic analysis that determined their ingredient composition, structural characteristics, and optimal consumption strategies. Mrs. Shopbottom's General Store presented different challenges: packaged goods that required opening techniques, canned items that needed specialized tools for access, and inventory stored in locations that required complex navigation skills. The store operation was conducted by teams with expertise in package manipulation and container opening. They had developed tools for accessing sealed containers without destroying the containers themselves, methods for extracting measured quantities of contents, and techniques for resealing packages to minimize evidence of their activities. Community hall operation was the most complex, as it involved simultaneous coordination with activities at other locations. The hall contained food contributions from multiple families, organized according to a system that reflected social relationships and contribution protocols that had evolved over decades of community celebrations. The hall team had to navigate this social organization system while extracting materials according to their own strategic priorities. This required understanding of human social dynamics, respect for community organization principles, and adaptation of their extraction techniques to accommodate the varied storage methods used by different families. By 3 a.m., Phase 1 had been completed successfully. Approximately 73% of Lower Middlebottom's Christmas food resources had been extracted and transported to storage areas controlled by the rat community. The operations had been conducted without human detection and without significant damage to facilities or containers. Operation Phase 2, Secondary Target Acquisition, 3:00 a.m. to 5:00 a.m. Phase 2 targeted individual households and specialized food storage areas that had been identified during reconnaissance but classified as secondary priorities. These locations contained smaller quantities of food but included items that had been designated for specific analysis purposes. The household operations required different techniques than the large facility operations: access to private residences, navigation of domestic environments, and extraction of materials from personal storage areas without creating disturbances that would wake sleeping residents. The teams had developed specialized quiet movement techniques that allowed them to navigate wooden floors, stairs, and doorways without generating sound levels that would attract attention. These techniques incorporated understanding of building construction principles, floor load distribution, and acoustic characteristics of different materials. The Warblethwaite household was targeted for its collection of preserved fruits and specialized baking ingredients that Mrs. Prudence Warblethwaite had accumulated for her Christmas preparations. The operation required accessing storage areas in the kitchen, pantry, and cellar without disturbing the sisters' sleep schedules. The Crump-Bottom household presented different challenges: a larger family with irregular sleep patterns, food storage distributed across multiple rooms, and the presence of young Timothy Crump-Bottom, who had developed a habit of midnight snacking that created unpredictable security risks. Cornelius III's residence was targeted for analysis of his personal food storage, which included items imported from London and specialized dietary materials that reflected his status as the town's primary employer. The operation required understanding of Cornelius III's domestic routine, which followed precise schedules that could be predicted but allowed little margin for error. The Cornelius operation was complicated by his habit of conducting late-night inspections of his residence for security purposes. The teams had to coordinate their activities with his schedule while maintaining operational effectiveness and avoiding detection during periods when he was awake and mobile. By 5 a.m., Phase 2 had been completed successfully. An additional 18% of Lower Middlebottom's Christmas food resources had been acquired, including specialized items that would support the analytical activities planned for Phase 3, Operation Phase 3, Analysis and Classification, 5 a.m. to 8 size. AM Phase 3 involved systematic analysis of acquired materials to determine their characteristics, quality, and suitability for various purposes. The analysis was conducted in the church vestry, which had been converted into a comprehensive laboratory facility equipped with tools and equipment that the rats had constructed for research purposes. The analysis included chemical testing, structural evaluation, and comparative assessment that determined nutritional content, flavor profiles, and storage characteristics of each food type. The testing was conducted using methodologies that Dr. Whiskers would later describe as sophisticated beyond normal mammalian capabilities, but consistent with enhanced intelligence resulting from mathematical environment exposure. Chemical testing was accomplished using natural sensory abilities that had been enhanced through training and systematic calibration. Teams of specialists had developed the ability to identify chemical compounds, determine concentration levels, and assess purity standards that approached the accuracy of contemporary human laboratory techniques. Structural evaluation involved assessment of physical characteristics, texture, density, moisture content, and stability under various storage conditions. This evaluation required understanding of material science principles and testing methodologies that exceeded normal animal intelligence parameters by substantial margins. Comparative assessment involved organizing analysis results into classification systems that would guide decision-making about resource utilization strategies. The classification systems were based on multiple criteria: nutritional value, flavor characteristics, storage requirements, and strategic value for long-term community sustainability. The analysis process produced comprehensive data that would support rational decision-making about resource management during the extended period when the rats planned to maintain control over Lower Middlebottom's food supplies. The data was organized according to mathematical principles and documented using notation systems that the rats had developed for information management purposes. By 8 a.m., Phase 3 had been completed successfully. The rats had achieved complete knowledge of Lower Middlebottom's food resources and had developed strategic plans for their utilization based on scientific analysis rather than opportunistic consumption patterns. Operation Phase 4 – Strategic Implementation. 8 a.m. onwards. Phase 4 involved implementing the strategic plans that had been developed based on the analysis results. The strategy was comprehensive and ambitious: maintain control over food resources while demonstrating enhanced mammalian intelligence through systematic management of community food distribution. The implementation began with establishment of controlled distribution points, where human residents could access food resources according to protocols established by the rat community. The protocols were based on mathematical principles of fair distribution, community sustainability, and demonstration of superior organizational capabilities. The distribution points were located at strategic positions throughout Lower Middlebottom: the church hall, the town square, and the area near the Middlethwaite facility. Each distribution point was staffed by teams with specialized skills in human interaction and resource management. The distribution protocols required human residents to present requests for food access in writing, specify the quantities needed, and provide justification for their requirements based on family size, nutritional needs, and planned usage. The protocols were designed to ensure fair distribution while demonstrating the systematic thinking that guided rat community decision-making. By 9 a.m. on Christmas Eve, Lower Middlebottom residents were discovering that their Christmas preparations had been systematically disrupted by agents unknown. The discovery process began when Father Mumblebottom arrived at the church for his morning inspection and found that the vestry now contained not his food stockpile, but a comprehensive set of written protocols for accessing food resources through controlled distribution systems. The protocols were written in precise handwriting on paper that appeared to have been manufactured specifically for this purpose. The language was formal and mathematical, employing terminology that suggested familiarity with administrative procedures and resource management principles. Most disturbing from Father Mumblebottom's perspective was the theological sophistication of the language, which included references to Christian principles of charity, community cooperation, and stewardship that suggested understanding of religious concepts. Wilhelm discovered similar protocols at his bakery, along with detailed analysis reports that evaluated his Christmas baking according to criteria that included nutritional content, structural engineering, and aesthetic design principles. The reports were complementary, but included suggestions for improvements that demonstrated understanding of baking chemistry and culinary arts that exceeded Wilhelm's own expertise in some areas. Mrs. Shopbottom found that her general store had been converted into a distribution center, where protocols were posted for accessing various categories of goods. The protocols were organized according to a mathematical classification system that grouped items by nutritional value, storage requirements, and community utility factors. Cornelius III discovered that his residents had been subjected to detailed analysis that included assessment of his personal food storage, evaluation of his dietary habits, and recommendations for nutritional improvements based on scientific principles. The recommendations were presented in formal reports that demonstrated understanding of human physiology and nutritional science that approached professional medical knowledge. By noon on Christmas Eve, the entire population of Lower Middlebottom had discovered that their Christmas celebrations had been systematically reorganized by agents who possessed administrative capabilities, scientific knowledge, and organizational skills that exceeded human community standards in several important areas. The agents had left comprehensive documentation explaining their activities, justifying their intervention, and providing detailed instructions for accessing food resources through their controlled distribution systems. The documentation was polite, thorough, and completely uncompromising in its insistence that their management systems were superior to traditional human resource management approaches. The documentation was signed with a collective identifier: the Lower Middlebottom Mathematical Research Community, accompanied by what appeared to be mathematical notation that Dr. Whiskers would later identify as individual signatures from each member of the rat community. Liking this video won't make it more interesting, but we appreciate the irony. At this point, You've invested more time in this story than most people spend choosing their life partners. The immediate response of Lower Middlebottom's human residents to the discovery that their Christmas had been systematically reorganized by mathematically enhanced rats was what sociologists would classify as confused acceptance mixed with administrative frustration. This response pattern reflected the community's long-standing adaptation to unusual circumstances and their general tendency to approach problems through committee formation and procedural discussion. Father Mumblebottom called an emergency community meeting for 2 p.m. on Christmas Eve. The meeting was held in the church sanctuary, as the church hall had been converted into a distribution center by the mathematical research community and was no longer available for traditional human meetings. The meeting was attended by all 847 residents of Lower Middlebottom, making it the largest community gathering in the town's recorded history. Previous meetings had typically attracted 30 to 40 participants, with attendance varying based on weather conditions and the perceived importance of agenda items. Following the prayer, Father Mumblebottom presented a summary of the situation based on information gathered from affected residents. His presentation was systematic and thorough, covering the scope of the food acquisition operation, the sophistication of the documentation left by the mathematical research community, and the implications for Christmas celebration activities. The presentation included reading excerpts from the protocols that had been distributed throughout the town. The protocols were written in language that combined administrative precision with mathematical terminology and occasional references to Christian principles of community stewardship. A typical excerpt read, "Food resource distribution will be conducted according to mathematical principles that ensure optimal nutrition for community members while maintaining sustainable resource utilization rates. Requests for access to specific food categories should be submitted in writing with justification based on family composition, dietary requirements, and planned consumption schedules. Distribution decisions will be made according to objective criteria that eliminate bias and ensure fair treatment for all community members." The protocols continued with detailed specifications for request procedures, distribution scheduling, and appeal processes for residents who disagreed with distribution decisions. The level of administrative sophistication suggested experience, with bureaucratic systems and understanding of organizational management principles that exceeded normal animal intelligence parameters by extraordinary margins. Wilhelm Crustbottom presented the analysis reports that had been left at his bakery. The reports included detailed chemical analysis of his baking ingredients, structural engineering assessments of his bread and pastry construction techniques, and recommendations for improvements based on scientific principles. One report analyzed his Christmas stolen according to criteria that included ingredient integration efficiency, structural stability under storage conditions, and flavor profile optimization for community dietary diversity. The analysis was accurate, thorough, and included suggestions for modifications that Wilhelm privately acknowledged would probably improve his baking results. Mrs. Shopbottom read excerpts from the inventory management protocols that had been installed at her general store. The protocols reorganized her inventory according to a mathematical classification system that grouped items by nutritional density, storage stability, and community utility factors. The reorganization was logical, efficient, and superior to her previous inventory management system in several measurable ways. Cornelius III presented the nutritional analysis reports that had been left at his residence. The reports included assessment of his personal dietary habits, evaluation of his nutritional requirements based on his age and occupation, and recommendations for dietary improvements that demonstrated understanding of human physiology and nutritional science. The recommendations were presented in formal scientific language. Subject exhibits suboptimal protein intake relative to occupational energy expenditure requirements. Recommend increasing consumption of preserved meat products by 15% and reducing refined carbohydrate intake by 8% to achieve nutritional balance appropriate for individuals engaged in precision manufacturing activities. The recommendations were accurate and would probably improve Cornelius III's health and work performance, which made them particularly frustrating from his perspective. Following these presentations, Father Mumblebottom opened the floor for community discussion of appropriate response strategies. The discussion lasted 4 hours and covered topics ranging from theological implications of enhanced animal intelligence to practical questions about accessing food resources for Christmas Eve dinner. Mrs. Prudence Warblethwaite raised the question of whether the mathematical research community's management of food resources violated property rights and community governance principles. Her concern was legitimate, but complicated by the fact that the mathematical research community had demonstrated administrative capabilities that exceeded those of Lower Middlebottom's traditional governance structures. Wilhelm suggested that the community attempt to negotiate with the mathematical research community to establish modified distribution protocols that would allow traditional Christmas celebrations while acknowledging their superior organizational capabilities. His suggestion was practical, but raised questions about the precedent of negotiating with mathematically enhanced rodents over community resource management. Mrs. Shopbottom proposed that the community accept the mathematical research community's management systems on a temporary basis while evaluating their effectiveness compared to traditional resource management approaches. Her proposal was rational, but implied acceptance of rodent superiority in administrative matters, which created philosophical difficulties for some community members. Cornelius III argued that the community should resist the mathematical research community's intervention on principle, regardless of the sophistication of their systems or the accuracy of their analysis. His position reflected traditional views about human authority over animal communities, but failed to address the practical reality that the mathematical research community had demonstrated superior capabilities in several important areas. The discussion continued without reaching consensus on appropriate response strategies. Community members were divided between those who favored accommodation with the mathematical research community and those who supported resistance based on traditional principles of human authority over animal populations. As the discussion progressed, it became clear that Lower Middlebottom faced a unique challenge in human-animal relations: what to do when animals demonstrate intellectual and organizational capabilities that exceed human community standards in measurable ways. The question had no precedent in British law, Christian theology, or community governance traditions. Lower Middlebottom was confronting issues that wouldn't be addressed by mainstream academic disciplines for another century: animal intelligence, non-human administrative systems, and the philosophical implications of interspecies resource management. Each way, 6 p.m., Father Mumblebottom concluded the community meeting without resolution of the central issues. He announced that Christmas Eve service would proceed as scheduled, though the traditional Christmas feast would be replaced by whatever food resources could be obtained through the mathematical research community's distribution protocols. He also announced that Christmas Day activities would be modified to accommodate the new resource management situation, with specific adjustments to be determined based on negotiations with the mathematical research community that would be conducted after Christmas Eve service. The meeting ended with Father Mumblebottom leading the community in a prayer that requested divine guidance for celebrating Christmas under circumstances that had never been anticipated by traditional Christian doctrine or community governance principles. The Christmas Eve service began at 7 p.m. as scheduled, though attendance was affected by ongoing negotiations between individual families and the mathematical research community regarding access to food resources for Christmas Eve dinner preparations. Approximately 234 residents attended the service, which represented a 72% reduction from normal Christmas Eve attendance. The reduced attendance was attributed to 3 factors: families engaged in distribution protocol negotiations, residents attempting to locate alternative food sources, and individuals who had decided to boycott traditional Christmas activities in protest of the mathematical research community's intervention. Father Mumblebottom conducted the service according to established liturgical traditions, though his sermon was modified to address the unique circumstances facing the community. The sermon, titled Divine Providence and Mathematical Intervention, attempted to provide theological interpretation of events that exceeded conventional Christian understanding of human-animal relationships. The sermon began with biblical references to God's use of animals for divine purposes: Balaam's donkey, the ravens that fed Elijah, and the great fish that swallowed Jonah. Father Mumblebottom suggested that the mathematical research community's intervention might represent divine testing of lower middle-bottom's spiritual resilience and adaptability to unusual circumstances. However, the sermon also acknowledged the theological difficulties created by animals that demonstrated administrative capabilities and moral reasoning that appeared to exceed human community standards. Father Mumblebottom admitted Mrs. Warblethwaite's musical program proceeded despite reduced choir participation and ongoing concerns about the community's situation. The choir consisted of Mrs. Warblethwaite, her sister, Miss Agatha Warblethwaite, and 3 residents who had attended the service despite the unusual circumstances. Young Timothy Crumpbottom was absent due to his family's ongoing negotiations with the mathematical research community regarding access to ingredients for Christmas Eve dinner. His absence eliminated the male voice from the choir and required Mrs. Warblethwaite to modify the musical arrangements to accommodate the available singers. The modified musical program included 4 traditional carols and Mrs. Warblethwaite's annual composition. The performance was affected by the reduced number of singers and the emotional strain created by the community's unprecedented situation. Mrs. Warblethwaite noted in her diary that the performance achieved adequate spiritual expression under challenging circumstances. The Christmas Eve service concluded with Father Mumblebottom's benediction, which requested divine blessing for the community during a period of testing that appears to exceed normal parameters for Christmas challenges. The benediction lasted 8 minutes and included prayers for wisdom, patience, and guidance in dealing with mathematically enhanced rodents who had demonstrated superior organizational capabilities. Following the service, residents dispersed to their homes to participate in whatever Christmas Eve activities were possible, given their limited access to food resources. Most families had been able to negotiate access to basic ingredients through the mathematical research community's distribution protocols, though the process had required paperwork, justification statements, and compliance with administrative procedures that exceeded normal Christmas preparation complexity by substantial margins. Christmas Day, December 25, 1873, dawned with what Father Mumblebottom's journal describes as atmospheric conditions consistent with divine ambivalence about recent developments in Lower Middlebottom. The weather was overcast, cold and damp, precisely average for Christmas in rural England, which seemed appropriate for a Christmas that had been systematically reduced to mathematical precision by administrative protocols implemented by rodents. The traditional Christmas morning gift exchange proceeded in modified form throughout Lower Middlebottom. Families gathered to exchange presents that had been prepared according to normal Christmas traditions, though the celebratory atmosphere was affected by ongoing uncertainty about access to food resources for the community Christmas feast. Children received their traditional gifts, handmade toys, educational books, and items that emphasized practical utility combined with moral instruction. The gift exchange followed established social protocols despite the unusual circumstances, suggesting that some community traditions were resilient enough to survive administrative intervention by mathematically enhanced animals. Cornelius III distributed pocket counting devices to his employees during a ceremony held at the Middlethwaite facility. The ceremony was attended by his remaining 12 employees and their families, creating a gathering of approximately 43 people who gathered to commemorate traditional employer-employee relationships despite recent disruptions to community resource management. Each pocket counting device was presented with a brief speech by Cornelius III, explaining its construction, calibration, and maintenance requirements. The speeches averaged 4 minutes per device and included technical specifications that demonstrated Cornelius III's continued commitment to precision manufacturing despite economic pressures and administrative challenges created by enhanced rodent intelligence. The employees received their gifts with expressions of gratitude that reflected appreciation for Cornelius III's maintenance of traditional employment relationships during a period when established social structures were being challenged by superior administrative systems implemented by non-human community members. At 11:00 a.m., Father Mumblebottom announced that the community Christmas feast would proceed as scheduled, using food resources that had been obtained through negotiations with the mathematical research community. The negotiations had resulted in distribution of approximately 60% of the food resources that would normally have been available for Christmas celebrations. The reduced food availability required modifications to the traditional feast menu, but the mathematical research community had provided detailed nutritional analysis that ensured adequate dietary value for community members despite reduced quantity and variety of available items. The Christmas feast began at 1 p.m. in the church hall, which had been temporarily returned to human use through negotiations between Father Mumblebottom and representatives of the mathematical research community. The negotiations had required Father Mumblebottom to submit formal requests, provide justification for temporary facility access, and agree to compliance with cleanup protocols that exceeded normal church hall maintenance standards. Attendance at the Christmas feast was affected by ongoing community divisions about appropriate responses to the mathematical research community's intervention. Approximately 412 residents attended, representing 49% of the community population. The reduced attendance reflected continuing disagreement about whether participation in modified Christmas celebrations represented acceptance of rodent administrative authority or practical accommodation to unavoidable circumstances. The feast proceeded according to modified traditions that accommodated reduced food availability while maintaining essential elements of community celebration. Tables were arranged to seat available participants. Food was distributed according to protocols that ensured fair portions despite limited quantities, and conversation was limited to appropriate topics that avoided controversial subjects related to recent administrative changes. Father Mumblebottom's blessing acknowledged the unusual circumstances while expressing gratitude for community unity during challenging times. The blessing lasted 14 minutes and included theological speculation about divine purposes behind recent events that might not be apparent to human understanding, but presumably reflected deeper spiritual meanings. Following the blessing, the feast proceeded with conversation that carefully avoided direct discussion of the mathematical research community while addressing practical matters related to community activities under modified administrative conditions. Residents shared information about successful negotiations with distribution protocols, compared experiences with mathematical resource management systems, and discussed adaptations to traditional activities that had been necessitated by recent changes. The feast concluded with the traditional singing of Christmas carols, led by Mrs. Warblethwaite and accompanied by whoever was present and willing to participate. The musical program was reduced due to limited attendance, but maintained essential elements of Christmas musical tradition despite administrative challenges created by enhanced animal intelligence. The aftermath of Lower Middlebottom's Christmas crisis followed predictable patterns of community adaptation to unusual circumstances, combined with administrative adjustments that reflected the practical realities of coexistence with superior organizational systems implemented by mathematically enhanced rodents. Dr. Whiskers arrived in Lower Middlebottom on January 3, 1874, to conduct his investigation of the unusual manifestations of animal intelligence that had been reported in London newspapers under headlines that included "Mathematical Rats Disrupt Rural Christmas" and "Rodent Administrative Systems Challenge, Human Community Governance." Dr. Whiskers' investigation lasted 3 weeks and included direct observation of the mathematical research community, interviews with affected residents, and scientific analysis of the organizational systems that had been implemented by the enhanced rodents. His methodology was thorough and systematic, though his research was complicated by the cooperation of subjects who possessed intelligence levels that approached or exceeded human standards in several measurable areas. The mathematical research Community provided full cooperation with Dr. Whisker's research, including access to their facility in the church vestry, documentation of their organizational systems, and participation in behavioral testing that demonstrated their enhanced cognitive capabilities. Their cooperation appeared to be based on recognition that scientific documentation of their achievements would support broader acceptance of their administrative innovations. Dr. Whisker's findings confirmed that the rats had developed intelligence, levels that exceeded normal mammalian parameters due to extended exposure to mathematical activities in the Middlethwaite facility. The intelligence enhancement was permanent and had resulted in cognitive capabilities that included abstract reasoning, complex planning, and social organization skills that approached human levels in several important areas. The organizational systems implemented by the mathematical research community were evaluated by Dr. Whiskers as superior to traditional human community governance in terms of efficiency, fairness, and mathematical precision. The resource distribution protocols eliminated waste, ensured equitable access to community resources, and provided administrative transparency that exceeded normal standards for rural community governance. However, Dr. Whiskers also noted that the mathematical research community's systems lacked certain elements that were important to human community life: cultural traditions, emotional considerations, and social relationships that were based on factors other than mathematical optimization. The systems were rationally superior, but culturally incomplete from human perspectives. Dr. Whiskers recommended that Lower Middlebottom develop hybrid governance systems that combined the mathematical precision of the rodent administrative protocols with human cultural elements that maintained community traditions and social relationships. The recommendation was practical, but required unprecedented cooperation between human and non-human administrative systems. The implementation of Dr. Whiskers' recommendations took place gradually over the following months. The mathematical research community agreed to modify their protocols to accommodate human cultural requirements, while the human community accepted mathematical precision standards that improved resource management efficiency. By December 1874, Lower Middlebottom had developed what historians would later classify as the world's first successful human-rodent cooperative governance system. The system combined mathematical resource management with traditional cultural celebrations, creating administrative efficiency that maintained community traditions while eliminating waste and improving fairness in resource distribution. The Christmas of 1874 proceeded according to hybrid protocols that satisfied both mathematical precision requirements and human cultural needs. Food resources were managed according to optimal efficiency standards, but distribution included accommodations for traditional gift-giving, community feasting, and cultural celebrations that reflected Lower Middlebottom's heritage and social relationships. The success of the hybrid system attracted attention from government officials and academic researchers who were interested in administrative innovations that might be applicable to larger communities. However, attempts to replicate the Lower Middlebottom system in other locations failed due to the absence of mathematically enhanced rodents with the necessary intelligence and organizational capabilities. Lower Middlebottom remained unique in British administrative history as the only community that successfully integrated non-human intelligence into governance systems while maintaining traditional cultural elements and social relationships. And now, before we conclude this monumentally uninteresting tale, I must fulfill my obligation to inform you about an opportunity that is as thrilling as everything else you've experienced in the past 2 hours. For a limited time, and by limited, I mean until someone remembers to take it down, you can purchase the Boring Christmas Calendar, featuring 31 days of easy expressions from our character and friend, Sleepsy Noel. Each day features a different facial expression that captures the essence of profound boredom that you've just experienced. Day 1, mild disappointment. Day 2, resigned acceptance. Day 3, existential ennui. Day 4. Mathematical contemplation. Day 5. Administrative fatigue. And 26 more expressions that perfectly capture the spirit of systematic tedium. This calendar represents the culmination of artistic achievement in the field of depicting emotions that no one particularly wants to feel, but everyone inevitably experiences when confronted with bureaucratic processes, mathematical precision, or stories about rodent administrative systems in Victorian England. The calendar is available through the link fixed in the comments below. Purchase it if you enjoyed this experience and want to be reminded daily of the profound emptiness that can be achieved through methodical attention to irrelevant details. Don't purchase it if you prefer calendars with pictures of puppies, landscapes, or other subjects that might accidentally provide momentary happiness. The calendar comes with a certificate of authenticity, guaranteeing that each expression was carefully calibrated to achieve optimal levels of boredom, without crossing the threshold into actual interest. It's printed on paper that meets standard paper requirements and features dates that correspond to actual calendar systems used by human civilizations. Sleepsy Noel, our boring Christmas character, spent months perfecting these expressions under the guidance of experts in facial expression analysis and tedium measurement. Each expression was tested for maximum boring impact and adjusted to ensure consistent quality across all 31 days. This is a limited time offer because enthusiasm for boring calendars traditionally declines after Christmas, though the decline is gradual and follows predictable mathematical curves that have been documented by researchers who study seasonal variations in consumer interest in administrative novelty items. Purchase now or don't. The calendar will exist regardless of your decision, much like the mathematical principles that guided the rats of Lower Middlebottom in their systematic reorganization of Christmas 1873. And so, we reach the end of our exhaustive examination of how rats ruined Christmas for hundreds of people in 1873. Though ruined might be an overstatement, given that the Christmas was ultimately celebrated according to modified protocols that satisfied both human cultural requirements and mathematical precision standards. The story of Lower Middlebottom's Christmas crisis has provided us with approximately 30,000 words of detailed analysis regarding events that had no lasting impact on human civilization, influenced no major historical developments, and taught no lessons that couldn't have been learned through less tedious methods. We have learned that mathematically enhanced rats can develop administrative capabilities that exceed human community governance standards in measurable ways. We have discovered that Victorian communities possessed remarkable adaptability when confronted with unprecedented challenges to traditional social structures. We have observed that bureaucratic precision can coexist with cultural traditions if both sides are willing to compromise on non-essential elements. Most importantly, we have demonstrated that it is possible to spend 2 hours examining the minutiae of a completely insignificant historical event and emerge with detailed knowledge that has no practical application to contemporary life circumstances. The rats of Lower Middlebottom continued their cooperative governance relationship with human residents until 1889, when the last of the original mathematically enhanced generation died of natural causes. Their offspring possessed normal rat intelligence and gradually reverted to traditional rodent behaviors, though they maintained slightly better organizational skills than average rats for several generations. Lower Middlebottom itself was demolished in 1962 to make way for a parking lot that was never built due to budget constraints and bureaucratic complications that were ironically less efficient than the mathematical precision that had characterized the town's golden age of human-rodent administrative cooperation. The site is now occupied by a small forest that grew naturally after the demolition debris was cleared. The trees show no evidence of enhanced intelligence, mathematical capabilities, or interest in resource management optimization. They simply grow according to normal botanical principles, which is probably for the best. Dr. Whisker's research report remained the definitive documentation of enhanced animal intelligence until his death in 1897, when his papers were donated to the British Museum's Department of Peculiar Natural History. The papers are still available for research purposes, though they are requested approximately once every 7 years by graduate students who need obscure source material for dissertation projects that no one will read. Father Mumblebottom continued, serving Lower Middlebottom until his death in 1889 from excessive meditation. As previously mentioned, his sermons remained lengthy, but incorporated mathematical references that reflected his experience with precision-based governance systems. His theological innovations were not adopted by other parishes, primarily because they required familiarity with administrative protocols that had been developed. Cornelius III's counting device business experienced brief prosperity during the hybrid governance period due to increased demand for precision instruments from communities attempting to replicate Lower Middlebottom's administrative innovations. However, the business declined when it became apparent that mathematical precision alone was insufficient to create successful governance systems without the presence of enhanced animal intelligence. The Middlethwaite facility was closed in 1894 and converted into a small museum commemorating Lower Middlebottom's unique period in administrative history. The museum operated until 1943, when it was converted to military storage during World War II. The contents were never returned after the war, and the building was demolished along with the rest of Lower Middlebottom in 1962. And that, dear viewer, is how the mathematically enhanced rats of Lower Middlebottom systematically disrupted Christmas 1873 through implementation of superior resource management protocols, created temporary improvements in community governance efficiency, and ultimately returned to normal rodent behavior patterns when their enhanced intelligence proved to be non-heritable. The story has consumed 2 hours of your life that you will never recover. You have invested more time in learning about this completely insignificant historical event than most people spend selecting their careers, choosing their spouses, or making any other decisions that actually affect their lives in measurable ways. If you remained conscious throughout this entire presentation, you have demonstrated attention span capabilities that exceed normal human parameters for engagement with irrelevant subject matter. You have shown patience that borders on the pathological and dedication that suggests either admirable persistence or concerning psychological patterns. You are now part of an extremely small group of people who possess detailed knowledge about mathematical rats, Victorian Christmas disasters, and the administrative challenges of human-rodent cooperative governance. This knowledge will serve no practical purpose in your daily life, contribute nothing to your professional development, and provide no social advantages in normal conversation contexts. Congratulations! You have achieved the singular distinction of completing the most boring video ever made about Christmas, rats, and administrative precision in rural Victorian England. The small Christmas detail I promised at the beginning of the red hat worn by Algernon the rat was indeed hidden somewhere in the middle exactly as advertised. You probably forgot about it by the time it was revealed, which demonstrates the hypnotic power of systematic tedium to erase short-term memory while maintaining just enough consciousness to continue listening. If you enjoyed this experience, you may have unusual psychological needs that should be addressed by qualified professionals. If you didn't enjoy it but watched anyway, you have demonstrated commitment that deserves recognition, though the recognition will consist entirely of the satisfaction of having completed something that most rational people would have abandoned after the first 10 minutes. Thank you for your attention, your patience, and your willingness to participate in this experiment in precisely calibrated boredom. Your commitment to experiencing the complete absence of entertainment value has been noted and appreciated by no one in particular. Subscribe if you want more content like this. Though "like this" may be an inappropriate description, since this content is designed to be unlike anything you might actually want to experience. Comment below if you have thoughts about mathematical rats, Victorian Christmas traditions, or the philosophical implications of administrative precision in community governance. Or don't. The rats certainly won't care about your engagement metrics, and they achieved superior community management without any social media presence whatsoever. Until next time, when we'll examine another completely insignificant historical event with the same methodical attention to irrelevant detail that has characterized today's presentation. This has been your guide through the mathematical precision of systematic boredom. Good night, or good morning. or good afternoon. The time of day is as irrelevant as everything else we've discussed for the past 2 hours. The end. Oh, and don't forget the boring Christmas calendar featuring Sleepsy Noel's 31 expressions of profound tedium. It's available for a limited time through the link in the comments below. Purchase it to commemorate your completion of this video or to remind yourself daily of the mathematical precision with which boredom can be achieved through systematic attention to detail. The calendar represents the perfect gift for people who have everything except a daily reminder of the existential emptiness that can be achieved through bureaucratic excellence and administrative precision. Order now, while supplies last and while you still remember why you might want to be reminded of this experience on a daily basis throughout the coming year.